Leprosy in medieval England was more than just a health issue. It effectively amounted to a life sentence. Once diagnosed, individuals were removed from their communities and sent to live in isolation, often in places known as Lazar Houses. The societal impact was significant, with the disease reshaping how the afflicted were viewed and treated, far beyond the physical symptoms. The term leprosy itself is complex. In biblical texts, it referred to a broad range of skin conditions, including ailments like psoriasis or eczema. These conditions, though uncomfortable, were relatively mild and focused more on ritual impurity than physical suffering. People labeled as unclean were temporarily separated from society, but could rejoin their communities once declared clean by priests, typically after recovery. In contrast, the form of leprosy that spread through medieval Europe, known as elephantiasis Graecorum, now recognized as Hansen's disease, was much more severe. It caused progressive physical deformities, resulting in lifelong isolation. Unlike the temporary exclusion seen in biblical accounts, medieval sufferers faced permanent segregation. The shared name between these two very different conditions led to confusion, which shaped society's harsh response and reinforced stigmatization. To manage the growing number of lepers, England, much like other European countries, established Lazar Houses. These institutions served as both places of confinement and care for lepers. They were typically funded by the church or through charitable donations and stood as evidence to the dual motivations behind their existence: a desire to protect the general population from the perceived threat of contagion, and a need to offer some measure of care and support to those suffering from one of the most feared diseases of the time. At the height of the epidemic in the 11th to 13th centuries, there were over 200 Lazar houses across England. These facilities housed thousands of lepers, which is particularly striking when considering that the population of England at the time was only a few million. Leprosy did not discriminate based on social class. Both peasants and nobility were affected. Even members of royal families were not immune to the disease's reach. Life within these Lazar houses was highly structured, with strict rules governing the movements and activities of the residents. Lepers were prohibited from traveling beyond a certain distance and were restricted in what they could touch, given the widespread belief that their touch could spread the disease. In some cases, gallows were even erected outside these institutions to serve as a warning of the severe consequences of breaking these rules. Inside the Lazar houses, life was characterized by a mix of religious discipline, medical care, and social isolation. Lepers were required to participate in daily religious services, and those too ill to leave their beds were expected to pray from their rooms. Religious obligations, including self-flagellation, were common during the penitential seasons of Lent and Advent. The entry of a new leper into a Lazar house was marked by a solemn ritual resembling a funeral. The individual was laid out in front of the altar, dressed in a shroud, symbolically dead to society. From that moment onward, they were considered legally and socially deceased, further reinforcing their separation from the world they once knew. The medieval church played a central role in managing and caring for lepers, often overseeing the operation of Lazar houses. Religious orders, such as the Order of St. Lazarus, were founded specifically to care for lepers. This military religious order, originally established in Jerusalem, later spread to Europe, with a significant presence in England, particularly at Burton Lazars in Leicestershire. The knights of this order were often lepers themselves, which allowed them to care for their fellow sufferers with empathy and understanding. Despite the charitable efforts extended toward lepers, the stigma associated with the disease remained pervasive. Leprosy was believed to be highly contagious, though it was not as easily spread as people feared. Transmission required direct contact with open wounds, and the disease was not easily passed through casual interaction. Nevertheless, fear of contagion ensured that lepers remained outcasts, living apart from the society that once included them. As the centuries progressed, leprosy began to decline in England. By the late 14th century, cases had become less common, and by the mid-16th century, The disease had nearly disappeared. This decline is often attributed to the strict isolation policies enforced by Lazar Houses, which helped to limit the spread of the disease. With fewer cases, many Lazar Houses were repurposed or closed, marking the end of an era in England's medical history. However, leprosy did not disappear entirely from the world. The disease persisted in other regions, particularly in places like India and Hawaii, where it continued to pose significant public health challenges. One of the most well-known stories from the 19th century involves Father Damien, a Catholic priest who devoted his life to caring for lepers in Hawaii. His selflessness and dedication became legendary, especially when he himself contracted the disease and ultimately died from it. The lessons of leprosy in medieval England offer valuable insights into the broader relationship between disease, society, and religion. The fear and stigma surrounding leprosy were largely driven by misunderstanding, yet these factors also spurred the development of institutions and practices aimed at controlling its spread. Isolation proved to be an effective method for reducing the number of cases, but it came at a high cost for those who were forcibly separated from their families and communities. Even in the face of widespread fear and prejudice, moments of compassion and care emerged. While the Lazar Houses were institutions of isolation, they also provided a degree of medical attention and comfort to those suffering from the disease. The Church played a central role in this care, and despite the harsh measures taken, the commitment to helping lepers reflected a balance between societal protection and compassion for the afflicted. The story of leprosy in England underscores the complex interplay between disease and society. It reveals how fear can lead to the marginalization of the sick, but also how communities can come together to care for those in need. The decline of leprosy in England was not just a medical victory, but also a social one, as it demonstrated the importance of both isolation and compassion in addressing one of the most feared diseases of its time. If you found value in this video, support our work by subscribing and hitting the notification bell. With new videos coming out regularly, there's always something more to discover on Built by History.